The collapse of France in June 1940 stands among the most devastating military defeats in modern history. But the human cost of that catastrophe is felt most painfully in the stories of the men who survived only to fall into German hands. They were soldiers who believed, with all the confidence of their generation, that France could not truly fall. They believed the Maginot Line would hold, that their defences were unbreakable, that the mistakes of 1914 to 1918 would never be repeated. What they did not know, what no one fully understood, was how swiftly modern warfare could overwhelm even the proudest army. The German invasion struck like a lightning storm. Tanks poured through the Ardennes, an area French planners thought nearly impassable. Motorized infantry followed with ruthless efficiency. The Luftwaffe shredded columns of retreating troops, reducing roads to rivers of fire and wreckage. As rail lines collapsed and communications faltered, entire French divisions found themselves cut off from orders, surrounded before they realized the front had shifted. The French soldiers fought bravely in many places, in Lille, in the Meuse, at Arras, but the speed of encirclement crushed them from all sides. By early June, small pockets of resistance fought desperately, unaware that Paris was already declared an open city and that the government itself was preparing to flee. Soldiers who had held villages for days suddenly discovered German forces advancing from behind. Regiments that believed reinforcements were coming were instead told to destroy their weapons and wait for capture. And so began one of the largest mass imprisonments in European history. More than 1.8 million French soldiers marched into captivity. For many, the surrender was not a moment of relief, but one of disbelief. They walked in long, exhausted columns, guarded by German soldiers on motorcycles or horses. The heat of June pressed down on their backs as they struggled to stay upright after days without proper food or rest. Some carried wounded comrades, others stumbled from sheer exhaustion. The roads were littered with abandoned equipment. Helmets, boots, rifles snapped across knee joints before surrender. The humiliation cut deeper than hunger. The first holding areas were little better than open fields surrounded by barbed wire. No tents, no shelter. Just dirt, wind, and the knowledge that the world they knew had vanished behind them. German guards shouted orders. Schnell, weiter, forcing the prisoners to sit, stand, or move endlessly as registration began. Some men still clung to hope that the process meant Geneva Convention protection. Others whispered that Russia's POWs had been treated brutally, raising fears that France might face the same. There was no certainty, only waiting, only fear, only the long shadow of Germany stretching eastward. When the freight trains arrived to carry them deeper into Germany, the French prisoners experienced captivity in its rawest form. They were pushed into cattle wagons, wooden boxcars normally used to transport livestock. 40 to 50 men per car was common, but testimonies reveal cases of 70 or more crammed inside when the German rail network was overwhelmed. The doors slammed shut with a sharp metal clang, sealing the men in a dark, air-starved space that smelled of sweat, mud, engine oil, and desperation. There were no seats, no latrines, no room to lie down. Men leaned on one another for the entire journey, shifting only when exhaustion forced them to move. Some fainted. Some prayed. Others cursed the commanders who had let the nation fall. A few tried to carve their names or regimental numbers into the wooden boards, leaving behind proof that they had existed. As the train rattled eastward, the prisoners listened to the constant squeal of metal wheels, the shouts of guards outside during stops, and the hammering of their own hearts as the air grew thin. At night, the temperature dropped drastically. Men shivered violently, their breath visible even in the darkness. By day, The sun baked the metal roof, turning the wagon into an oven. When the train stopped briefly for water or inspection, the doors sometimes slid open just long enough for a blast of light to expose the gaunt faces inside. Guards tossed in a single bucket of water or a loaf of bread meant to feed 50 men. Fights sometimes broke out, only to be quieted by the reality that they all faced the same fate. After days of travel, the first signs of Germany appeared. Dense forests, quiet villages, long shadows cast by watchtowers rising above the horizon. The French prisoners stumbled out of the wagons, disoriented by daylight and the sudden space to breathe. They were ordered to stand in rows as German officers inspected them. Then came the stripping of identity. Dog tags were recorded. Personal belongings, watches, letters, photographs were taken. Some guards mocked the soldiers, calling them weak, defeated, broken. Others remained silent, performing their duties with mechanical indifference. Once processed, each prisoner received a number. It replaced his name. From that moment, he was not Jacques, Louis, André, or Marcel. He was simply Gefangene 51234, or another number etched onto a metal tag. That number would define him for the remainder of his captivity. Life inside the Stalags began with shock. The men were marched to wooden barracks, long rectangular structures, often built hastily by Polish or Czech prisoners who had arrived earlier. The barracks were cold in winter, sweltering in summer, and always infested with lice. Triple-tier bunk beds lined the walls, each with a mattress stuffed with straw that was rarely changed and often full of insects. Thin wool blankets offered little protection against the German winter, where temperatures frequently dropped below freezing. Roll call, appel, took place at dawn and sometimes again at night. Guards forced the prisoners to stand outside regardless of weather conditions, counting them repeatedly until the numbers matched. If one man was missing, the entire group could be punished. Some appels lasted hours, especially when guards suspected an escape attempt. Men stood trembling in the cold, their breath forming clouds, their boots sinking into mud or snow. Frostbite took more than toes. It took lives. Food rations were minimal. Breakfast might be a cup of ersatz coffee. Lunch a thin soup made of turnips or cabbage. Dinner a small piece of bread sometimes mixed with sawdust to increase volume. Starvation weakened the men. Their cheeks hollowed, ribs became visible, and energy drained from their bodies like water from cracked stone. Yet they still worked, because the German war machine demanded labour. Most French prisoners were assigned to labour detachments, Arbeitskommandos, which sent them to farms, factories, coal mines, rail yards, or construction sites across Germany. These small work units often treated POWs slightly better than the main camp, because local civilians sometimes offered scraps of food. But conditions varied wildly. Some French prisoners found themselves working for farmers who treated them decently, even kindly, seeing them as victims rather than enemies. Others were sent to mines where air was thick with coal dust, walls trembled with each blast, and death from accident was constant. Inside the barracks at night, men whispered about home. They shared stories of wives, children, parents, and villages left behind. For many, the worst pain was not physical. It was the silence from France. Letters were delayed, censored, or never arrived. Some men waited months for a single message. Others never heard from their families at all, believing the worst without confirmation. Still, hope flickered. Secret radios operated by brave prisoners tuned into BBC broadcasts. Men gathered in hidden corners to listen to news of the wider war, of Britain fighting on, of resistance movements growing, of the possibility that one day, somehow, France would rise again. These moments of forbidden knowledge gave the prisoners strength, and strength was the only currency that mattered. Discipline inside the camps varied depending on the commandant, but cruelty was never far away. Some guards were veterans hardened by years of war, others were young recruits eager to prove themselves. Punishments ranged from loss of rations to solitary confinement in the dreaded bunker, a dark, cramped cell where prisoners were left for days with little food or water. Escape attempts resulted in brutal repercussions. Even failed plans brought harsh reprisals for entire barracks. Yet escape remained a constant dream. French prisoners dug tunnels beneath barracks, concealed maps under floorboards, forged documents using ink made from burnt rubber or crushed berries, and studied the movements of guards with the precision of spies. The Germans mocked them, believing the French lacked the daring of British or Polish prisoners. But this stereotype ignored the hundreds of French escape attempts recorded during the war. Some succeeded. One prisoner, a former railway worker named Henri, hid inside a sack of potatoes on a supply truck. Another dressed as a German civilian using clothes stolen from a laundry shed. Two men once attempted to escape by painting themselves as workers and walking through the front gate at dusk. They were caught only because a dog detected them at the final checkpoint. Punishment was swift, but so was the return of hope. The men refused to accept that captivity was permanent. Meanwhile, the war outside the wire raged on. British bombers roared overhead at night. The distant thundering of anti-aircraft guns echoed across the camp. Sometimes prisoners watched the sky glow red from firestorms miles away. They longed for liberation, but feared retaliation. If Allied planes hit near the camp, guards often responded by tightening control or reducing rations. By 1943, the tide of war had shifted. News of German defeats in North Africa and Russia spread silently through the barracks. Prisoners exchanged glances of cautious optimism. They believed liberation was approaching, but no one knew when. Men who had survived 3 years of captivity feared they might die just before freedom arrived. Some prayed, others simply endured. The Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, became lifelines. Inside were tins of meat, biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, and occasionally jam. The arrival of parcels turned barracks into markets where cigarettes were currency. One cigarette could buy a loaf of bread. A full packet could be traded for a warmer blanket. For many prisoners, Red Cross parcels meant the difference between survival and starvation. Still, even with these fragile comforts, captivity wore down the mind. Loneliness, monotony, and uncertainty gnawed at every prisoner. And liberation, though closer, remained just beyond reach. The winter of 1944-1945 was the most brutal period French POWs endured. Germany was collapsing, but desperation made guards more unpredictable. Food was scarce for Germans themselves, and prisoners received even less. Soup grew thinner, bread smaller, and work hours longer. Many French prisoners were forced to clear rubble after Allied bombings. Dangerous, exhausting labor, where collapsing buildings, unexploded bombs, and falling debris claimed lives almost daily. Yet even then, small acts of humanity flickered in the darkness. Some German civilians quietly handed prisoners pieces of bread, apples, or warm clothing. Others looked away, unwilling to risk punishment for helping the enemy. Children stared at the prisoners marching past, too young to understand the nature of war. For the French soldiers, these brief encounters with civilian kindness reminded them that the conflict was between governments, not ordinary people. As Allied forces closed in, chaos spread through the German ranks. Orders changed daily. Some camps were evacuated, forcing prisoners on deadly marches through snow and ice. Death marches that claimed countless lives. Others were abandoned by guards who fled before the Allies arrived. Still others became battlegrounds as frontline fighting swept across them. In one camp in Silesia, French prisoners awoke to find the guard towers empty, rifles leaning against walls and gates hanging open. Unsure whether it was a trap, they waited for hours before cautiously stepping outside. The landscape was silent, littered with discarded equipment and hastily abandoned documents. Liberation came not with fanfare but with uncertainty. In other camps, liberation was dramatic. American, British, and Soviet forces smashed through barbed wire fences, greeted by cheering prisoners. Men who had nearly starved embraced their liberators with tears in their eyes. Some kissed the tanks, others knelt in prayer. After years of captivity, freedom felt unreal, fragile, overwhelming. But liberation was not the end. Many French POWs returned home to a country divided between Vichy supporters and resistance fighters, between families who had survived bombings and those who had lost everything. Some returned to discover their wives had remarried, believing them dead. Others found their homes in ruins. A few returned to silence. No family left, no letters waiting for them. The emotional wounds ran deep. Nightmares lingered. Many could not sleep in beds for months, preferring floors that felt more like the barracks they had known. Some struggled with guilt for surviving when others hadn't. Others carried injuries that would never fully heal. Yet they carried something else as well: resilience, strength, the quiet pride of men who had endured captivity and refused to surrender their humanity. They had survived hunger, cold, labor, humiliation, and years of uncertainty. And when they walked again on French soil, they did so with the knowledge that their suffering was part of a larger story, a story of endurance, hope, and the belief that France, like them, would rise again. For the French POWs of World War II, captivity was a prison of the body, but never of the spirit. Their story remains one of the war's most powerful testimonies of survival. The liberation of French POWs in 1944 to 1945 did not bring immediate relief. For many, freedom came wrapped in confusion, hunger, and the shock of re-entering a world that had changed beyond recognition. In the final months of the war, as German authority crumbled, prisoners heard the distant thunder of Allied artillery rolling closer day by day. Hope surged, but so did fear. The German guards, now desperate, became unpredictable. Some turned crueler, blaming the prisoners for Germany's defeat. Others became strangely indifferent, focusing on their own survival rather than guarding the camps. Rumors spread constantly. The Americans are near Stuttgart. The Russians have crossed the Oder. The British reached the Rhine. But no one knew what to believe. Secret radios offered fragmented news, and each new broadcast sent waves of excitement or dread through the barracks. For those in eastern camps, the approach of the Soviet army was both salvation and terror. Stories of violence and chaos accompanied tales of liberation. For those in the West, the steady push of American and British forces brought a different kind of anticipation. Yet even as liberation approached, the prisoners' suffering did not lessen. Food shortages worsened. The Germans prioritized their own survival over feeding captives, and rations that had already been meager now shrank to starvation levels. Bread became scarce. Soup turned to little more than dirty water with floating cabbage threads. Men who had survived 4 years of captivity grew weaker than ever, collapsing during work or roll call. Disease spread easily in the overcrowded barracks: dysentery, pneumonia, influenza. In early 1945, many camps were evacuated as the front moved closer. These forced marches, sometimes called death marches, pushed prisoners through snow and ice with almost no food or rest. Men walked until their feet bled, until they fell asleep while moving, until they collapsed and were left behind. Some guards shot stragglers, others simply ignored them, letting them die in the cold. French prisoners marched alongside Russians, Poles, Belgians, Italians, and Yugoslavs, all tied together by the same agony. The frozen roads became graveyards marked only by footprints and shadows, but not all camps were evacuated. Some commandants chose to surrender peacefully, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation. Others abandoned their posts entirely, leaving the prisoners to fend for themselves. In one stalag, the French prisoners awoke to find the gates unlocked and not a single guard in sight. Unsure whether it was a trick, they waited for hours before carefully stepping into the snowy fields beyond the wire. When Allied troops finally reached the camps, liberation arrived with emotional force unlike anything the prisoners had ever felt. American tanks were often the first signs of salvation, rolling toward the barbed wire as cheering erupted from behind the fences. Men who had been reduced to skin and bone climbed onto the tanks, hugging the crews, shouting, crying, laughing. Some collapsed from shock or joy before they could speak a single word. Liberators described scenes where prisoners wept uncontrollably or kissed the boots of soldiers who had become symbols of life itself. In British liberated camps, discipline and order returned quickly. Medical teams arrived with blankets, food, and nurses who tended to the most fragile survivors. French prisoners, long accustomed to scarcity, struggled to believe that the crates of biscuits, chocolate, and canned meat were truly theirs. Liberation by Soviet forces was different, chaotic, explosive, unpredictable. Some camps saw joyous reunions with Red Army soldiers who handed out bread and cigarettes. Others descended into disorder as guards fled, civilians looted nearby buildings, and control changed hands abruptly. And yet, the return journey to France was long and complicated. Some French POWs were transported by truck or train to repatriation centres. Others walked miles to Allied lines or hitchhiked with military convoys. A few wandered through ruined German towns, searching for any route west. Roads were clogged with refugees, German civilians fleeing the Soviets, forced labourers trying to go home, soldiers deserting, and prisoners seeking food. Europe had become a continent of wandering souls. At repatriation points, medical staff examined returning prisoners, documenting their weight loss, wounds, and illnesses. At repatriation points, medical staff examined returning prisoners, documenting their weight loss, wounds, and illnesses. Many French soldiers weighed less than 50 kilograms. Some had lost the ability to stand without assistance. Others carried frostbite scars, respiratory problems, or injuries from labor accidents that would last a lifetime. But the greatest wounds were often invisible. Nightmares haunted the freed prisoners. Sudden noises triggered panic. Some woke screaming in the middle of the night, convinced they were still in the barracks. They had been liberated, but liberation did not erase the years of hunger, cold, humiliation, and fear. The road home was full of triumph, yet also full of ghosts. Homecoming was not the joyful celebration many prisoners imagined during their long captivity. France in 1945 was a damaged country, economically broken, politically divided, emotionally scarred. Cities lay in ruins from years of bombing. Families had been displaced, separated, or destroyed. Returning French POWs stepped into a homeland that no longer resembled the France they had left behind. At reception centres, soldiers received new uniforms and small payments as compensation for their service. But these formalities could not prepare them for the emotional shock of reunion. Some returned to wives who had spent years believing their husbands were dead. Others found their children grown, unable to remember them. A few discovered that their families had moved away or died without the Red Cross being able to deliver the news. And there were darker stories. Wives who had rebuilt their lives, believing their husbands lost forever. families who had collaborated with the Germans, relatives who feared the return of men hardened by captivity. French society was fractured between supporters of Vichy, members of the resistance, victims of occupation, and those who simply tried to survive under impossible conditions. Returning prisoners stepped into these divisions, often feeling like outsiders in their own country. The government labeled them rentrants, returnees, and set up programs to reintegrate them into civilian life. But psychological trauma was poorly understood at the time. Men who suffered from nightmares, depression, or sudden bursts of anger were often told simply to move on. Many could not. The camps had carved deep scars into their minds, their sense of identity, their capacity for trust. Some former POWs drank heavily to numb the memories. Others threw themselves into work, desperate to feel useful again. A few isolated themselves, unable to connect with families who could not understand what captivity had been. The simplest sounds, a whistle, a barking dog, the clatter of boots, could trigger memories of roll call or guard patrols. Yet there were also extraordinary stories of resilience. Some former prisoners formed associations to support one another, gathering in cafes to share memories with those who understood. Others wrote memoirs, documenting the realities of captivity so future generations would not forget. Some dedicated themselves to honoring comrades who never returned, ensuring their names lived on in local memorials. The years of imprisonment had broken many men, but they had also forged others. The spirit that sustained them in captivity became the foundation upon which they rebuilt their lives. Still, the shadow of the camps followed them everywhere. Freedom had come, but healing would take years. As France rebuilt itself after the war, the experiences of POWs slowly faded from public discussion. The focus shifted to resistance heroes, the liberation of Paris, the Normandy landings, and the rebuilding of Europe. French prisoners of war, especially those held in Germany, became a quieter chapter in the national memory, overshadowed by louder narratives. Many former POWs felt forgotten. They had survived years of cold, hunger, and forced labor, only to return to a France that did not fully recognize their ordeal. The government provided some compensation, but emotional recognition was harder to attain. Stories of captivity rarely made headlines. The public associated POWs with surrender, a sensitive subject in post-war France. Still, the former prisoners remembered. They held annual gatherings, created associations, and spoke at schools when invited. They kept diaries, letters, and photographs that testified to their years behind barbed wire. Some visited the remains of the camps decades later, standing before rusted fences and crumbling barracks where they had once fought for survival. The legacy of French POWs extended into families as well. Children grew up hearing fragments of their fathers' stories. Whispers of hunger, frostbite, labor camps, escape attempts. Some fathers refused to speak about the past, locking the memories away. Others spoke too often, trying to make sense of the years lost. These stories shaped generations, becoming threads woven into the wider fabric of France's wartime experience. Historians later recognized the importance of these accounts. Captivity had been a crucial part of the war, economically, socially, and psychologically. The German war machine had relied heavily on POW labor, and French prisoners had helped keep factories and farms running even as the Reich collapsed. Their endurance under harsh conditions demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Many scholars argued that captivity was a silent battlefield, fought not with weapons, but with the human spirit. In time, memorials were built. Books were written. Documentaries aired. The forgotten chapter of French POWs slowly re-entered the national consciousness. Their suffering, once overshadowed, was now acknowledged as an essential part of the war's history. Yet even with recognition, the emotional truth remained personal. Each former prisoner carried his own memories, his own days of hunger, his own nights of fear, his own longings for home. The story of captivity was not one story, but thousands, and each one deserved to be told. Among the most powerful themes in the memories of former French POWs was the concept of dignity, how to preserve it, how to protect it, and how to reclaim it after years of humiliation. Captivity stripped men of their identity, reducing them to numbers, laborers, statistics. But throughout their imprisonment, many French soldiers found small ways to hold on to their humanity, teaching each other languages, composing music, carving small wooden objects, writing poetry in secret notebooks, or sharing the last crumbs of a Red Cross biscuit with someone hungrier. These acts of solidarity saved lives. In the brutal freezing nights of winter, French prisoners slept in clusters to share warmth. Those who received Red Cross parcels often divided them evenly among their comrades. When one man grew too sick or weak to work, others helped carry him or argued with guards to spare him. During air raids, prisoners risked their lives to pull comrades from collapsing structures. The camp became a strange family, united not by choice, but by shared survival. Liberation allowed these men to step outside the wire, but it could not erase what they had endured. Freedom felt overwhelming at first. The open sky seemed too large. The ability to walk without permission felt unreal. The sensation of sleeping in a soft bed made some prisoners restless. They had grown accustomed to the hard boards of the barracks. For many, the world outside felt frighteningly loud and fast. Years of captivity had slowed their bodies and minds, reshaping their instincts. But gradually, life returned. Families embraced. Children learned the faces of fathers they had never known. Villages welcomed their soldiers home. And France, slowly rising from the ruins, began to remember the sacrifices of all who had suffered. Soldiers, civilians, resistance fighters, deportees, and POWs. The story of French prisoners in Germany during World War II is not one of defeat, despite the circumstances of their capture. It is a story of endurance, a story of quiet resistance, a story of men who held on to dignity when everything was designed to strip it from them. They were not forgotten. Their diaries, letters, and memories remain powerful reminders of the human cost of war. They show that courage does not always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it lies in simply surviving another day, sharing the last crust of bread, or believing, against all odds, that freedom will come. And for countless French POWs, one belief remained constant through the cold nights, the empty stomachs, the endless roll calls, and the years of uncertainty. They believed France would rise again. Food rations shrank as Germany redirected its resources toward the Eastern Front. A typical day began with a cup of ersatz coffee, bitter, black, and made from roasted barley. Lunch was a watery soup, sometimes with a few floating cabbage leaves. Dinner, if they were lucky, included a small piece of dark bread, often harder than stone. Yet despite hunger, sickness, and exhaustion, thousands of French POWs continued to hold on to a thin thread of belief that France would one day rise again. In Stalag Theatre, located near Görlitz, the prisoners began to develop routines to survive. They gathered scraps of wood to heat small stoves, shared memories of meals back home, and exchanged letters when the Red Cross managed to deliver them. Rumours spread quickly. Some claimed that the British were preparing a massive bomb offensive. Others whispered that American support was growing. These fragments of hope circulated like currency in the camp. At night, men gathered around makeshift tables to talk quietly, protecting the flame of a smuggled candle that illuminated their worn faces. One soldier, a former teacher from Paris, kept a diary in tiny handwriting to save paper. He recorded stories other prisoners told him, believing the world needed to know what happened behind the wire. "Someday," he wrote, "these stories will matter. Someday France will want to hear what we lived through." But not all prisoners were given equal treatment. Soldiers from French colonies, North Africans, Senegalese tirailleurs, and Indochinese troops faced harsher conditions. Some German guards viewed them through racist ideology and assigned them to the most brutal work details. Many were refused Red Cross parcels entirely. Their barracks were overcrowded, their medical care almost non-existent. Yet even under these inequalities, solidarity formed. French prisoners often shared rations with North African comrades. Men who came from completely different worlds found unity in suffering and captivity. Work became a central part of POW life. The Geneva Convention allowed non-officers to be used as labourers, and Germany exploited this fully. French POWs were sent to mines, factories, farms, rail yards, and lumber camps. Each assignment carried its own dangers. Those sent to coal mines inhaled dust that scarred their lungs. Those in steel factories worked beside molten metal with no protective equipment. Farm labourers endured bitter cold, rising before dawn to tend fields that fed the German war effort. Despite the hardships, many prisoners preferred work details because it meant leaving the overcrowded main camp. Outside, guards were often fewer, and local civilians, many of whom resented the war, sometimes offered quiet acts of kindness. A warm potato slipped into a prisoner's pocket, a cup of milk left near a barn door, a sympathetic glance that reminded them the world contained more than cruelty. Escape attempts, though rare, became symbols of resistance. Some men dug tunnels beneath barracks floors, hiding the soil in boots or scattering it around the yard during roll call. Others crafted fake documents, forged stamps, or stole civilian clothes from work sites. The Germans responded by building more watchtowers, reinforcing fences, and imposing harsh punishments for failed attempts. Yet the attempts continued because they represented something larger than freedom. They were proof that the prisoners had not surrendered their spirit. One group of French officers in Oflag IVC famously created a coded radio using smuggled components, listening secretly to BBC broadcasts. As the war dragged into 1942 and 1943, the prisoners' world changed again. Germany's fortunes shifted sharply after the disastrous defeat at Stalingrad. Supplies to the camps grew even more scarce. Guards, once arrogant and confident, became irritable and nervous. Air raid sirens echoed across the Reich as Allied bombers targeted industrial areas. POWs watched from behind barbed wire as distant cities burned, knowing the destruction marked a step closer to liberation. But danger reached the camps too. Bombs sometimes fell near labour detachments. In one incident near Essen, a factory where French POWs worked was hit directly. Several prisoners were killed instantly, and survivors were forced to clear rubble and carry bodies while guards shouted at them to move faster. The absurdity of dying in an Allied raid, an attack meant to liberate Europe, left many prisoners shaken. Still, most understood the larger purpose. Germany was weakening. Letters from home shifted in tone as well. Families described German occupation in grim detail: ration shortages, curfews, arrests. Some wrote about joining resistance networks, hiding weapons, or sending information to the Allies. Others wrote in coded messages to avoid censorship, using family expressions that conveyed hidden meanings. Every letter, no matter how brief, became a lifeline. Men read them repeatedly until the paper softened from handling. But not everyone received letters. Some families had been displaced. Others lived in zones too chaotic for correspondence. The silence weighed heavily on these men. They often wandered the camp during free hours, staring through the wire at distant fields, imagining the voices of loved ones they had not heard in years. By early 1944, tension in the camps grew as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Western Europe. Prisoners whispered about a second front opening soon, and after the Normandy landings in June, hope surged through every barracks. Men celebrated quietly, fearing reprisals if caught. But with hope came new dangers. The Germans began relocating prisoners deeper into the Reich, farther from advancing armies. Long marches, later known as the death marches, forced exhausted POWs to walk for days with little food or shelter. Those who fell behind risked being shot. Bitter winter winds tore at their clothes, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Yet many prisoners described these marches as paradoxically hopeful. They sensed the war closing in on Germany. As Allied armies advanced from both east and west, the German command grew desperate. Some camp guards abandoned their posts, while others became more violent. Food became almost non-existent. The men scavenged potato peels, chewed on raw beets, and boiled grass to make weak soup. Disease swept through weakened bodies, lice infested clothing. It finally came in the spring of 1945. In some camps, the Americans arrived first. In others, the Soviets. Liberation was chaotic. Some guards surrendered peacefully while others fled into forests. When tanks smashed through camp gates or soldiers cut through barbed wire, men cried openly. Some collapsed from emotion. Others ran toward the liberators, waving rags like flags. Photographs from these moments capture hollow faces transformed by joy, disbelief, and overwhelming relief. Doctors treated the malnourished, distributing food carefully to avoid refeeding shock. For many, the first warm meal in years brought tears to their eyes. But liberation did not erase the scars of captivity. The journey home was long and slow. Some French POWs travelled by truck convoys, others by trains or makeshift medical transports. When they finally crossed into France, they saw cities in ruins, families forever changed, and a nation struggling to rebuild. Many were welcomed as heroes, but others found their experiences misunderstood or overshadowed by larger political narratives. Some struggled with survivors' guilt, remembering comrades who had died in camps or on forced marches. Others carried injuries that never healed, damaged lungs, weakened limbs, or psychological wounds that lingered for decades. Yet even with all the suffering, many former prisoners spoke of the same belief that had sustained them through captivity. The belief that France would rise from the ashes. They rebuilt their lives, raised families, wrote memoirs, and shared their stories, so future generations would understand the cost of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Their time in German camps had stolen years, but not their dignity. And as long as their stories are told, the world will remember what they endured behind the wire.